so we are in our third segment and the last segment of our talk with Dr. Matthew McVarish. In the first two segments, we've discussed about Dr. McVarish's journey as a survivor and his own experiences, and we've covered a lot of aspects around shame, sorry, and sexuality, and about sexual abuse of boys versus girls, and around the whole aspect of silence, and a lot of other interconnected aspects. I think in this segment, I want to start with the discussion where we left in previous segment about homosexuality. Again, referring to your book, Matthew, you had talked about being gay, and how is that connected at all with being sexually abused as a child? We had raised this in my first interview as well, where my friend shared experiences as a lesbian. But it would be interesting to know from you whether, because again, a lot of clients that I work with, male survivors who are gay, are constantly questioning whether they are gay because they were sexually abused by a man as a child.
Yeah.
What would you say about it?
It's important to make the distinction that being sexually abused in your childhood cannot alter your sexual orientation. It can make you very confused. It can make you very scared of sex, and so when you have all these lingering issues around your own sexuality, it can take a very long time to reach a point where you know what orientation you have. Because of all the fear that you may have been left around, the fear and confusion around sex, it can leave you with, unable to really explore your own sexuality. But so, for example, my three brothers and I were all sexually abused by the same person. We all suffered exactly the same abuse, and in their adult life, I've realised that I'm gay, and they're all still completely heterosexual, and they're married and have kids. So it's impossible to say that I was turned gay by being abused by my uncle. That's not what happened. I think there's parts of Africa where there's, I think they call it correctional rape, where groups of men go around, and any woman who identifies as lesbian, and they rape that woman, and they believe that that will cure her of her homosexuality. And that's so ridiculous. The idea that you could alter someone's sexual orientation by sexually traumatizing them, it is barbaric and also completely unenlightened. So all that abuse can do is kind of create a lot of fear and confusion around your own sexuality. And I would encourage anyone who's been abused to just take their time, and obviously explore it at their own pace and in safe ways. To realize what they are, but there's no shame in whatever sexuality you eventually find yourself to be.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because I think it will benefit a lot of people, because a lot of clients ask me this, and I totally agree with you. You are who you are, your sexual orientation. I don't think homosexuality is an illness or disease which can be cured, or it just happens to you one day. So this is something that you are. It's part of your personality, your sexuality, and it doesn't get altered in through abuse or trauma or things like that. So yes, thank you for sharing that. Moving into the next aspect, I think I would like to explore a little bit more about how did you then go about file a police complaint against your offender, and how was that process? Because again, in our documentary, we see that process can be really horrific for a lot of people, which again becomes another barrier for people to abuse. But in your case, again, your offender did get prosecuted and punished. So do you want to share a little more about that? How did that come about, and what was the outcome and the process?
Well, after we produced the play in Glasgow, and my family and I began to speak about it, just my brothers, we asked Sandra Brown at the Moore Anderson Foundation if they would engage with us, and they immediately offered me and my brothers therapy, and then Sandra Brown herself, in fact, made the report to the police on our behalf. And like I said earlier, like, we're fortunate in Scotland and in the UK that we have these kind of systems put in place to support victims and survivors in what is essentially a very can be a very scary and challenging process. There is so many things in place now, and we pressed charges 2000 and he was sentenced in 2010. So the whole process took 18 months. And that was over a decade ago, and there's been advances in the police system and the judicial system since. They're constantly trying to come up with new ways of supporting victims through the process. We're constantly trying to inform every officer that they meet and how to handle someone who has experienced trauma, and the fact that someone who is reporting trauma may immediately go back into dissociation and go back into a traumatized state as they're recounting previous events. And how do you elicit the information you need when you're talking to someone who is literally traumatized? So in Scotland particularly, we are making huge steps into try and create the whole process as trauma friendly as possible. That's a kind of ridiculous statement, trauma friendly, but to make the process as comfortable as it can be. And of course, it's going to be uncomfortable at points as you recount uncomfortable memories. But as much as being done as can be done to make the whole process doable,
Yeah. Yeah, I guess you mean trauma and being trauma informed, and that's what we work around culturally, and trauma informed interventions, of course. But I think what I would be interested again in exploring is, how does this legal process, I know it is difficult, it's hard to go through that, recount all that happened, but when the offender gets prosecuted, does this have any link with recovery from sexual abuse? What do you think about the elements of recovery? Would it help someone if you are sexually abused, you go and file a police case and the offender gets prosecuted? Would that help in recovery, or is what are the elements of recovery that you would emphasize?
I would say it might help with your recovery, but don't count on it. I would say that for me, the prosecution of pursuing my uncle's prosecution was about child protection. It was about removing him from contact with children, because we knew how dangerous he was, and no one else he was in contact with were aware of that. So for us, the first thing was about protecting other kids. The process, so we got interviewed, the police came to our homes individually and took a full statement. That takes a long time, because you have to remember everything that you can that's going to be helpful, and the police have to write it down very slowly, and then you have to read it to yourself to make sure that's correct. So that is probably, it's like going to the dentist for an entire day. Can be very painful. And for me, because the abuse had happened over the space of 10 years, that took quite a few hours with the police officers, and they were in my home, and they were very nice police officers, but that was very tedious and very long that day, making the statement. The next part of the process was the court appointed an advocate, like a lawyer, to work on our behalf. And then, of course, my uncle was given a lawyer, a defense lawyer. And when they looked at the evidence that me and my brothers had, provided, his lawyer, my uncle's lawyer, advised him to plead guilty, because if he was to plead innocent, he would be proven guilty by the evidence that we had, and then he would get a much worse sentence. So, and also basically he'd be wasting the court's time by trying to pretend he hadn't done this. So he was advised to plead guilty, and so he pled guilty to all of the charges. I think in total, it came down to about 11 separate charges based on all the different years of abuse, the way they do it legally. Mm-hmm. So he pled guilty, and that meant that we did not have to give evidence in court, because he'd already said, yes, I did this. Now, that also meant that he got the maximum reduction on his sentence. He would have got 9 years in prison, but he got 6 because he'd plead guilty. So we reward criminals for playing along, basically. So he got 3 years reduced sentence because he didn't. If he'd said that he was innocent, we would have had to have gone into court and give evidence, and that would have been further traumatic for us. So I would say to anyone considering pressing charges against their offender to be prepared that they might plead guilty. They might try to pretend that they're innocent, and that might mean you have to do the court process. And I was fortunate in the sense that I didn't, because my offender, we had so much evidence that wasn't a possibility for him.
Right. Yeah. So I think what a lot of people I know again think that once he's punished, I will feel better. Something that we were discussing earlier. Some people think that all the time wishing the offender to be dead. So once the offender is dead, I will feel better. But again, we talked about your offender who died some time
Yeah.
ago. So how did you feel about that? Like, are these really elements of recovery, or how does it make you feel? If not, then what is it that helped you in your recovery journey? So if you can just kind of link these aspects.
I would say that for me and my brothers, one of my brothers was really, it was really important to him that my uncle was sentenced, um, for his own justice, I think.
Mm.
Um, but when we were in the courtroom, my uncle stood after at the end of the hearing, and he turned and he looked at us, and he had handcuffs on, and it was quite pathetic. And he just looked at us and said sorry. And in one way he had apologized, but that one word that he threw towards us meant nothing, and it almost invalidated the years, the decades of suffering that we'd been through. And so it can be, and my brother then felt that it just wasn't enough, you know, for him to say one word sorry. So we got an apology, but what is it? So he said sorry. So are we supposed to feel okay now? So another thing that happened was my uncle in September last year, I got a phone call through a family member to tell me that he died. He'd been found dead in the apartment where he'd been living. And then a lot of people said, "Oh, that must be a great relief that he's now dead." And of course, it wasn't, because I always assumed that in my life there would one day be uh, this time when I would speak to him and I would confront him. Because in the whole court process, I never spoke to him. I spoke to the police and I spoke to lawyers. He was there. I never engaged with him directly. And so I'm now left with, I'm 38 years old. The abuse for me ended 25 years ago. And I have so much that I want to say to him. And he's dead now. And I have no opportunity to do that. So what do I do with these feelings?
Mm.
And what I do is I channel them into activism and trying to help other people, because there's nothing else I can do with all that.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I think this is how, again, as researchers or practitioners, one looks at it, like that child sexual abuse is not a syndrome. It's not like you have fever, you take a pill and it's gone. It's like uniform for everyone. But child sexual abuse or any kind of such psychological trauma, it's very individualistic. Also, in many ways, there are a lot of universal factors which affect everyone, of shame, silence that we've just discussed, and the elements of trauma associated with that. But recovery and journey towards healing is a very personalized journey, and prosecution may help some but not others. The death of the offender might be a useful milestone for some but not for others. So it's
Mm.
really about looking at your feelings and emotions, as you said, and what you really do about it, and not keeping it suppressed. And as you had said in the first segment, understanding that it was not your fault at all. And I think you talked about these 3 stages of recovery in your book,
Yeah.
as well. So I would actually encourage people to read your book, and we will give the link to the book in the description box. But I'll let you talk more about, like you just said that in for your own journey, uh, converting a lot of your feelings and emotions into activism and going forward and doing work around that helped you. So maybe this is a good point to start talking about your journey from survivor to being an activist. So if you can talk more about your project, Road to Change, you've told us a little bit about that, but also then about your book and other things that you're doing, to address sexual abuse at a larger, broader level.
I think so. After the play was done and my uncle went to prison, the play then became a film, and we started showing that around the world to different places. And the people in the audience who'd watched the film or the play would disclose their abuse, and sometimes we realized that they were in a place where there was the statute of limitations, so they were finally talking about it for the first time, but the crime that they were talking about had happened maybe 15 years ago, and now that in their country, wherever they were, that was no longer valid because the limitation on reporting the crime. But the offender that they were talking about was still maybe in his 60s or 70s and still in contact with children. So what we saw was this dangerous legislative situation which is happening all over the world. And I kind of got motivated to try and focus on this issue. And I began with Europe. So the campaign grew very simply as I would walk from London to Paris and then Paris to Luxembourg and eventually walk around all of the EU when Britain was in the EU. And I was going to ask every government to remove this law. And so that was a very simple concept, but it was a massive logistical project at the same time. And this had varying degrees of success. Some governments would engage with me and immediately launch a motion in their parliament to discuss this, abolishing this law. Other countries just refused to engage with it at all. But I eventually met the Croatian government and I asked them to remove this law, and they said, we can't remove that law because we only just created that law. And I was like, why did you do that? And they told me that they'd ratified a convention by the Council of Europe called the Lanzarote Convention, which was drawn up in 2007 to help specifically prevent child sexual abuse across Europe. And part of that treaty had an article about the statute of limitation, and what it said was your country's limitation must give the victim sufficient time to come forward. And that paragraph assumes that your country has a limitation. Now, Croatia didn't have one, but when they read that, they thought, oh, we're supposed to have a limitation, so they brought one in.
Okay.
So this was a mistake. So then after I got back to Edinburgh and I met you, I was invited back to Strasbourg, to the centre of the Council of Europe, where all 47 governments come together in one room. And I asked all the governments to basically abolish the law, but specifically I asked them to change that paragraph in the treaty, which would, instead of saying make sure that you give the victim enough time, I wanted it to say abolish any limitation on reporting. So that was in Strasbourg, and I was addressing the 47 countries of Europe. But whilst I was there working on that, then I got invited by the United Nations to chair global discussions on child protection. And that's when I started working. I think one conversation was child sexual abuse within the circle of trust. And I think the delegates, I was chairing, but the delegates were from different African nations and South American nations. And what I was starting to learn there were things that were so culturally alien to me, like situations of witchcraft where children are being sacrificed and violated. And I was like, wow, this situation of the sexual abuse of children is so universal, but at the same time complex and unique to every territory of this planet. But like you say, there are commonalities. So then I got invited to Bangkok to ECPAT International. ECPAT have organizations in over half the countries in the world. And the plan was to basically create a global forum of survivor activists. Because I kind of fell into activism through speaking up about what happened to me. Right. But all the way around the world, there's other people who've done the same in their journey from whatever violation that put them onto this path. And the plan was to bring all the activists together and see if we could push for global change together. And I think, so if you think about it, from simply writing a play to try and catalyze a discussion in my family about my uncle, I ended up at the highest level of conversations that can happen on this planet.
International level, yes.
And the more higher it got, the thinner it got. I felt that the more you get away from the ground, your impact gets lighter and lighter, the more you spread yourself thinly. And so I realized that I need to go back to, if I want to help anyone, if I want to make a difference, you need to do it almost directly one-on-one. And that's when I was working in, I won't say which country, but a Scandinavian country. And I was speaking on television, and a child wrote to me and asked me simply, how did you recover from the abuse? And no one had ever asked me that question. A really simple question. And I realized that the child who was writing to me really needed to know the answer to that question. Right. And so I thought about it very, very hard. How did I recover? How is it that I'm not a drug addict, and many other people who have experienced things that I experienced, you know, their adult life is chaotic. So I went back over my life and I tracked the things, the opportunities that were afforded to me, and the choices that I made that led to my recovery. And I wrote back to this child through their therapist, and the child's therapist said to me, would it be okay if I take the child's name off of that letter and share your letter with all of my young clients, because nobody has ever explained to them in this simple way before. Yeah. And that's basically what became my book, It's called the Truth That No One Tells Teenagers, and it's 10 facts that every teen victim has the right to know. And it's basically a guidebook from how to get from where you are to where you want to be, which is recovered. And recovery is not a place, it's not a destination. Recovery is a direction, so you're always getting better. And when I meet someone who's just disclosing for the first time, I kind of see them as being just 20 years further back that along the road that I've traveled along, because I first disclosed when I was 17 to a therapist.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that's kind of how the book came about.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think it's really interesting the way you put it, because a lot of people ask me this question, that is full recovery possible at all? And so I think that the way you put it, that recovery is not a destination, and that's important to know, that it's probably a process or a journey that you need to take. And there might be elements that will keep coming back to you even when you feel you have recovered, or it might be a different direction for different people depending on where in life they are and their experiences. So I think it's a really good way that you've put. And as I said, will give the link to your book in the description box so that people can access it. I know it's available on Amazon and other forums, so I'm sure it would be. I enjoyed, and there's an Audible book as well, which I heard, of course. So I think it will be useful for different people, specifically children who are trying to recover from CSA. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I wrote it for a young audience so that a teenager could understand it. But the information in it, even if you're in your 60s or 70s, you can. It's
Yeah.
never too late to start healing.
Yeah.
It's the same information. And with the book, I created a website called helpnearme.info, where I've listed organizations similar to the Moy Anderson Foundation, but in as many countries as I can find. At the moment, we've got over 100 countries listed, which is not, just over half of the world. Where if you're reading my book, because you can buy it on Amazon, so you can buy it anywhere in the world, I think. You hopefully, once you go to that website, which is explained in the book, you can find someone in your local area to give you that immediate help.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that, because we'll put that link to your website, Help Near Me, as well in the description box. Because after listening to this talk, if there are people wanting to access help, then it would be helpful for them to look at your website. And also I want to urge my listeners that if they want to get in touch with me or us, we'll try our best to connect you to the right resources, no matter where in the world you are. So yeah, feel free to get in touch with us as well. My email and contact details are in the channel information. But the website that Matthew is talking about, Help Near Me, has a list of various organizations in a lot of countries. So that would be a good start as well. So I think that's very useful to know. I think we've covered a lot of issues, and this is something which we can go on talking about. But I think at this point, I want to ask you, what next? So you've done so much. Your journey has been really inspirational for a lot of people I know, and for myself as well as a practitioner. So, and you've done so much at the international, not only your 10,000 miles walk, which I was like, how did you manage that? Just walking across Europe, but also then all the things that you've done with ECPAT and Global Survivor Forum and things like that. So where do you see yourself now, and what next?
I think, well, for me, it's about in my lifetime to have a genuine impact, and I think partly one half of me says that because my uncle sexually abused me when I was a child, does that mean that I need to dedicate the rest of my life to somehow being involved in this issue? I think there's a part of me that started this journey through my own anger, and as I become more and more healed, that anger that used to push me is transmuted into a kind of compassion that pulls me towards helping with this issue. And that's why I kind of felt, what's the realest impact that I can have? And then that's why I thought, I really want to get the book into the hands of the people who need it. So the book, if you imagine, is a guide to recovery, it needs to be free. It needs to be available to every. I think 1 in 5 children will be sexually abused before the age 18. So what I'm trying to do at the moment is get the book as a free resource, so that it's available in every school in the UK, certainly, and hopefully beyond soon. And so that's it. Basically, my plan at the moment is very simple, and it's to try and help the next generation of victims and survivors, and sadly there's going to be millions of them, to not take 20 years to then start to recover or make a report, to try and intervene immediately, so that this resource of how to recover and what to do and how to get the legal help is becomes normalized and becomes freely accessible. So at the moment I'm trying to, obviously COVID has created logistical problems with schools, so it's not a great time in the history of Britain to try and introduce anything new into British schools. But I'm trying to partner with organisations to just basically make this book freely available, which is going to be a lot of printing and a lot of distribution, but that's all really.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and also I do get a lot of requests, like right after this call in about half an hour. I'm speaking to someone in another country who's meeting his government on Monday to address the statute of limitations. So I'm still helping other activists. I'm part of a global network of activists, and various projects come up in various parts of the world, and everyone just puts in their expertise to help other people. So the public don't really see that happening, but it is constantly going on now.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's amazing to see how you've transitioned in your own life and your own journey. And I think for people, it would be really inspiring to know that there's so many ways or steps towards recovery and different directions towards recovery. So, and of course, having said that, and thanks for mentioning that, of course, it's not really the responsibility of survivors to actually go and do this work or spread the word around or constantly keep working on these issues. Or sometimes people also feel that maybe feeling compelled that to save other children, I must report. Yes, it's a good thing to do. And activism and going out and service, like I did another research on recovery of childhood sexual abuse, and we did it in Scotland as well as in India. But service and activism came up as one of the steps for a lot of people in their recovery. But again, it's not their responsibility, and they need to know healing from it. Talking about it and dealing in their own lives is, yes, something that survivors can take responsibility for. But then it's up to you really if you want to do and help other people. And if it becomes one of the direction in your recovery, I guess it's a good thing. But it's not to take it up as feeling responsible for others. Does that
Yeah,
make sense? What would you say?
absolutely. I think I say in the book, if you're on an airplane, they say, put on your own oxygen mask before you help the person next to you put on theirs. And I think recovery, for anyone who's been abused, I think it's important to look after yourself first. Otherwise, you're not going to be strong enough to help anyone else.
Yeah.
So, and the best thing you can do for yourself if you were abused in childhood, I think, is to recover your life. Do exactly what you want to do with your life, no matter what they did to you, and then you'll truly have overcome what they did to you if you just take ownership of your future.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a good note on ending this talk. I can go on talking about it with you, but I think we'll end this segment here. And any last other message that you want to give before we finally close this segment, or you think we've covered quite a bit?
Oh, my head's spinning. We've talked about it so
I
much.
know we've talked about so much, but I think the last note that you said was really important. So thank you very much for being on this talk with me. I think it's been really valuable, and I really urge listeners and viewers to take a deep breath again and reflect on all that we've talked about. And please seek help if you need to. The links are in the description box. And if after listening to this talk, if you feel upset or disturbed or any memories come back to you, flashback or something, feel free to get in touch with me. We'll try and me and my team will try and connect you to the right resource wherever it may be possible. So we'll try and get you help as much as possible. So yeah, thank you so much, Matthew. I really appreciate this talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.